Good morning, everyone. This is the Police, Fire and Crime Panel meeting on the 24th of June 2024. The first item on the agenda is appointment of chairman. Are there any nominations for chairman, please?
Councillor Heason.
I'd like to nominate Councillor Peters for chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is that seconded by anyone? Second. Are there any other nominations? No. Is the panel in agreement? It's Councillor Peters. And are you happy to chair again?
Yes, I am. I'm grateful for that support. Thank you. More than happy to continue. Are you moving to deputy or me?
No, you now.
Okay. Item 2 on the agenda now is the appointment of a vice chairman, and I'd like to nominate Councillor Heason as deputy. Is that seconded, please? Thank you. All those in favour? That's carried. Thank you. Just to go back to the formalities, we're now on Monday the 24th of June at Staffordshire County Council in the Oak Room, Police and Crime Panel meeting starting at 10 a.m. The agenda has been issued. I assume everyone's seen it. We've looked at items 1 and 2 on the agenda. I'll now move to item 3 and ask, are there any apologies?
Yes, Chair, we've had apologies from Councillor Merrick.
Thank you. Item 4 on the agenda, are there any declarations of interest? No, thank you. Item 5 on the agenda refers to minutes of the meeting held on the 5th and 12th of February. They're detailed on pages 5 to 18. Can I assume that they've been read and there are no comments? If there are, please identify yourself. No? Right, thank you. Item 6 is questions to the Commissioner from members of the public. Andy, do you want to?
Thank you, Chair. We've had 3 sets of questions from members of the public. The questions are detailed in the paperwork and the Commissioner's responses. We've also had a follow-up question from Mr. Riley, and the Commissioner has circulated the response to that today, which I will arrange to go onto the internet for public viewing. Mr. Reid is available at the back. He's attended the meeting. I think normally extend a right for a supplementary question, if he wishes.
Yes. Mr. Reid, have you a supplementary question?
Yes.
Okay, please.
To call to the table.
Would you like to step to the table, a convenient slot, and let the panel hear what you have to say, please?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for my answer, which I'm happy with. Just a further point from the Sentinel 3 weeks ago today, that's the sort of thing which I think I'd like to see in the press. Details about the speed camera enhancement sites that are being used, how many people have been caught speeding at each one, and I hope that will be featured in the future for other speed cameras that are in the county area. For example, it seems at Trent Vale 635 people were caught speeding there in only 6 months. That's a lot of people going through a busy urban area. So I hope that these figures will be published in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner, do you wish to respond to that?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Reid. And I appreciate your interest in not only speed cameras, but the wider use of automatic number plate recognition, which, as the previous answer details, I think, really is an important part in identifying criminals using our roads, identifying them, stopping them, quite often drink drive related, drug drive related, and quite often going equipped for nefarious activity. So it's something we're going to continue to invest in. Particularly pleased with the rollout of the mobile AMPR, because we are seeing vehicle crime in particular start to move away from the southern borders of the county up more north into the county and city. But we're going to continue our investment in road safety. Actually, in recent times, the police have been publishing in advance on social media where speed cameras, where the speed camera vans are likely to be located as well. And this is all to try and assist people to slow down. This is not about enforcement in order to generate revenue. That's not the case anymore. That was the case over a decade ago. This is all about encouraging a change of behaviour and safer driving. We lost 45 people on our roads last year. It's way, way too many, and we're not going to let up in doing what we can to reduce the number of people killed and seriously injured. So thank you for that. And by the way, Chairman, we will continue to tell the newspapers, advise them, everything we're doing in this area, and hopefully they'll publish it like that report, because it does help people just to stop and think.
Thank you, Commissioner. Item 7 on the agenda, decisions published by the Commissioner, and we then go on to a detailed list of the decisions that have been published.
Please excuse me, Chairman. I just wonder, we had a letter, a question from Mrs. Mallender about the voting turnout, which I don't believe I gave a written response to. Were you expecting me to say something today to that?
No, but if you wish to say something, please do.
Yeah, I did say I'd give a verbal response. So she asked the question, given that the turnout for the police, fire and crime election was just over 19%, doesn't that raise embarrassing questions about me having a mandate and being representative? And will I be taking 19% of my salary in line with the voting turnout? I guess that's a sort of challenging question, one that actually was, on the one hand, I was a bit disappointed to see. On the other hand, I think she asked a fair question. My own view about the mandate is more people voted for me to continue with confidence that I would do a good job than voted against me to do that. So I was perfectly comfortable with the outcome. Where there's a low turnout, as long as that's the folk who are paying the most attention, the most interest, the most concern for their local communities, then that's a very informed mandate, and I'm comfortable with that too. The previous PFCC election tallied with the county council elections as well, and I think it was about 10% higher. So low numbers, but 30% is typical for most local elections, probably less actually. And I don't think there's been a question to suggest that local councillors and other representatives operate at full capacity, but on a third of their income. That is not appropriate. And similarly, we're likely to see, I don't know, maybe only 50-60% in the upcoming general election as well. So I'm comfortable that there is a mandate. I absolutely intend to use it, and it's 100% effort from me, even if it's just a 19% turnout. And I think, to be fair, people are not as enthusiastic about politics at the minute as they have been in the past. So that was, I would suggest, a low point in turnout. And hopefully in the future we're going to see more and more people backing every election in Staffordshire to a greater degree. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. If I may just say, on behalf of the questioner, this panel will hold you to account, as you know. But whilst holding you to account, we're also here to support you. And we will expect value for money, and you know that that's the pathway that we'll follow. And if there's any areas of concern that spark any questions similar to the ones that you've shared with us, we'll be on to that straight away. Right, where did we get to?
Questions on decisions taken, item 7.
Yeah, questions on decisions taken. Is there any more to say, Commissioner?
Are there any questions on the decisions?
From us?
From us, yeah.
Yeah.
From the panel.
Do the panel have any questions around the decisions that have been taken? Yes.
Robertson.
Councillor Robertson, just push the button. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and apologies for not being able to figure out the machinery. Commissioner, thank you for the detailed reports and the detailed reports about the decisions. I think that it's very useful, and I think that idea of transparency is really valuable. Looking through the decision notices, though, I don't think there's currently a section in the pro forma that's used that ties the decision that's being made back to the strategic plan. I'm aware that's being updated after the elections, but do you think that kind of longer term, when that plan's in place, that this could be effectively extended to just have that exposition about how this decision is meeting those needs that you've put into the strategic plan?
Commissioner?
Thank you. I think that's a good suggestion, and we'll change the pro forma. Some of them are going to be directly related to the local police and crime and the local fire and rescue plans, which I put together. Some of them are going to be related to the policing plan and the fire and rescue risk-based assessment plan. So there's sort of a nuance really as to which they hit most closely. There's the operational requirement that the two chiefs are responsible for, and then there's the strategic outcome, which we're all trying to achieve. So I think that's a nice idea. We'll make the link more directly. And there's some key ones there, particularly around estates, victims, and high harm in terms of sexual assault. So they're key decisions. Thanks for that, Councillor.
Thank you. Any more questions? Another one? Please do.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Commissioner, for that response. It's glad to see that we're starting off by agreeing. It's always a good thing. The next, there's kind of two questions that are interlinked about decision 11 and decision 10, if I can. And they're both specifically in relation to consultation. If I start off with the estates decision, the consultation says that the consultation was undertaken with sergeants and CDOs, but no kind of, I don't want to use the phrase main scale officers, but are you entirely comfortable that that consultation that we got is sufficient, having just come from those kind of more senior, less public-facing officers? And then leading on from that into the refurbishment of Longton Police Station, the preamble that's in the decision notice talks about how Longton is one of the stations that we struggle to get people to want to work in, and we're suggesting this refurbishment will solve that. But none of the consultation in relation to that decision was undertaken with any officers, as far as I can see. So whether you think that that's a potential weakness, having not had that consultation from officers about the refurbishment, and then therefore about the commissioning of our response to it.
Commissioner.
Thank you. I think if what I'd like to do there is just double check the consultation and what's been written about it. I'm aware for some years actually there's been conversations with people using the facilities at Longton, and there's a constant exchange of opinion with the custody officers as well. The custody environment in particular is really quite high pressured, and just understanding the terms and conditions of the staff as well as the working conditions is really key. In both cases there'll be national demands, expectations and standards expected, and indeed that's even commented on in His Majesty's Inspector's reports. I'm pleased with the investment in both. It's considerable amounts of money going into both, and Longton's a piece of estate that we see having a considerable future in the city, so I think it's over £3 million we're investing there. A lot of it is about working environment that directly supports the efforts of the front line. So whether they're offender management or working in neighbourhood policing there, air conditioning, heating, working facilities, better lighting are all part of the package. And I know the estates team spend a considerable amount of time talking to everybody involved and actually advising and understanding where they might like to be relocated and the type of building they want to work in. So I'm going to just revisit the paper if you don't mind. I'm very happy to feed back. It's not something that I'm concerned about, but perhaps the paper isn't comprehensively making the case about that wider engagement. As you say, everybody needs to be involved in designing their workspaces.
Yeah, I think that was a very informed question, Commissioner. And would you be able to respond before the next meeting so that our colleague will have a chance to take it all on board?
Yep, we'll do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to mention question 7, Staffordshire Domestic Abuse Victim and Perpetrator Services. I think it's well known to parties that we're now into this football tournament, and those circumstances can often aggravate this issue. Are the police on a higher level of alert looking for those things, and have you given any specific instructions on how the community would expect to be looked after?
Yes, thank you. There's been quite a considerable amount of communications activity around this in the weeks leading up to the football, really encouraging people to recognise the signs, understand their own risk of becoming violent, or particularly related to drinking and losing control, but also to encourage people who feel they are under threat to reach out to the service if they need help and advice. I think it's sensible, given that it is, unfortunately, please excuse me, it's not rare for the numbers of domestic assaults to go up during that period. As you say, Chairman, that's probably the most significant area of investment that my office and I make in victim support. And we increased it by something like £500,000 in this latest contract. Tens of thousands of people in the last few years have gone through that service, and it continues to take more and more inquiries. And what we're particularly watching at the minute, there's a new requirement from government to recognise children in a domestic abuse situation as individual victims of crime. And there are some implications for how victim services deal with that, and who is most appropriate, actually. It's not always the case that our victim service is the right person to provide the support there. So close working with children's services in the city and county is key, and that's further developing. There's also a risk in a couple of years' time around some advisors, independent, they're called IDSVAs and ISVAs. Now I'm hoping somebody on the panel might know exactly what the text is. One's to do with violence and one's to do with other advice. Really, really important professionals who advise people, funded by the Ministry of Justice at the minute. Now there's no guarantee that that's going to be continued to be funded after, I think, another 18 months. I would argue, and we'll be lobbying hard as Police and Crime Commissioners, that it does continue to be funded. It's too important. It's right at the sharp end of domestic abuse. And domestic abuse, as you'll be aware, is a considerable demand for the police service and a considerable risk to people of highest harm.
Thank you for that. Yes, Sean.
So do you track domestic abuse cases against things like football events and so on? I mean, do you track the number of domestic abuse incidents that get reported against those sort of real-time, real-world issues? Or is it just part of a general statistical accumulation of facts? I mean, do you try to track both local and national events against the trends in domestic abuse?
Chairman, through you, yes, indeed we do. I mean, the service are looking at they'll be looking at their own future demand. They'll be looking where they can to put out preventative messages like they are now, help people to become aware of the risk. Unfortunately, every holiday season's the same as well. Christmas, there's a heightened risk. And of course, there's that particularly a difficult period during the pandemic where actually the expectations across the country were realised. There was an increase, but in Staffordshire there was a reduction in the number of reports. And that was because people were actually not necessarily in a position to reach out for help, couldn't communicate, couldn't necessarily leave the environment to make a phone call. And we saw a blip after the pandemic. So yes, there's really valuable reasons for monitoring these peaks and troughs, and where possible, getting ahead of them with this good public health advice.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any more questions in that section of the agenda? Okay, item 8 on the agenda, fire misconduct and complaints annual report. Commissioner, there's been a fair amount of information in the press from other parts of the country as to the behaviours within the fire service, which were quite shocking, really. And I don't think it's represented at all in Staffordshire. But could you just talk to item 8 on the agenda, the annual report, please?
Yes, indeed, Chairman. As you said, there's been some high-profile national stories. It started with an investigation into the London Fire Brigade. I'm pleased to report that they had a special HMI inspection now. I don't know whether they're actually in engage about it, but they're in a process, and they've been discharged from that, which is good news. But there have been a number of other specific areas, force areas, including Wales, apologies, I can't quite remember which Welsh force, and recently in Shropshire as well. And I think people, if they've seen the parliamentary select committees, will have been particularly surprised to hear about some of the stories. And I think the members of that committee and the chair were rightly, rightly more than disappointed, because this is one of the services that we hold in the highest regard. Standards do matter. My chief executive and I have taken a particular interest in this in the last 3 years. We talk with we meet with the chief and the deputy fire officer regularly, and this is an agenda item for us. We're interested in complaints, but actually we're primarily having conversations about misconduct. So where the national stories are around bullying, misogyny in particular, those are the types of issues that we simply won't tolerate in Staffordshire. The service has had 1 or 2 issues in the past. I'm very comfortable with where they are at the moment and the efforts being made, particularly to engage independent HR advice around complaints and process. And what we're hearing from His Majesty's inspectors at the moment is a drive for more consistency and an approach that is standardised across the country. It hasn't been in the same way as it is with police. There isn't such a thing as a professional services department. In fact, for some forces, that might be a big ask in terms of investment, given the smaller numbers. But that type of approach, where a body looks at all these cases, I think is coming down the line. It's certainly part of inspectors' recommendations. And indeed, the fire reform white paper, which government put out for consultation before the election, does talk about that as well. Anybody who works in HR, large organisations, even councils will know much of this is about the confidence and training and capacity of line managers to sort of intervene and provide support quite early when things aren't going well. I'm very comfortable with the way that Staffordshire have looked to enhance the capacity of their leadership all the way through, so that fewer concerns get to the end point. Chairman, I believe in the paper we're setting out that we're going to come back to you in February 2025 with a full report on this. Be the first one we've done, I think, of that nature, along with the police complaints and misconduct summary. And I'm very keen that we keep an eye on this at least annually anyway, because it's important not just to be sure everybody working in the service is working in a good environment, but also that anybody who wishes to join Staffordshire Fire and Rescue is coming in confidence. You'll see in the paper we've got improvements in systems. There's a new software system which is helping us manage the process for complaints. And the complaints numbers, by the way, are very low. So far this year we've had 1. Last year 31. Average is about 41. So these are low numbers of complaints. And then in misconduct, we have a tracker, that supervisory management training that I mentioned to you, and an assurance from me that my chief executive and I take a personal interest. In fact, we look at every single issue that might go to tribunal or something like that to understand and consider if there's anything more concerning underneath it. And the key thing there is that the fire service now has a set of standards in place, the first one of which was the core code of ethics. Our chief fire officer, Rob Barber, was involved in drafting that for the National Police Chiefs. It is exactly the basis on which you'd want to build a sort of foundation for good standards. So I hope that helps, Chairman. Very happy to take any questions.
Yes, thank you. It does. And just to acknowledge the point that you make, leadership, interventions before unacceptable behaviour becomes the norm is vital. Because once it becomes the norm, it's like arriving 10 minutes late for work every day. If no one tells you about it, that becomes your start time. So I think we are assured by what you've said today. But I think we'll probably raise this again at some point, just to make sure that I know you will have your finger on the pulse, but we were looking for that level of reassurance now as we move forward, because the stories from the metropolitan area were distressing beyond belief. And that select panel, it was an eye-opener. Never heard anything like it. I sat and watched it, I recorded it, watched it again. Just couldn't believe what was being said. Colleagues, any questions on that point? Charlotte?
Do you have a whistleblower policy and protocol so that if someone does indicate that there's something happening, maybe not necessarily the victim of abuse, but somebody else, and what is your whistleblower policy to ensure that whistleblowers are not in any way prejudiced by their action?
In terms of a specific policy, I'm going to need a bit of help to identify whether that's a sort of formal policy. I'm pretty sure we do, and I think we'll bring that back between meetings just to reassure you. I am conscious that in the last 3 years there's been issues raised that I think you definitely put in the bracket of whistleblowing. Ultimately, I get to see all of them, and it's really for me as the fire authority, as it were, and the ultimate employer in fire, a bit different from the police arrangement, to take due note of those, and I do. I take them very seriously. I would just caveat that with some balance. It's also important, I think, to understand the motivations sometimes behind those that choose to suggest that they're whistleblowing. And I think that's where you need to be careful, perhaps bring in some independent advice and maintain a distance as you're considering what they're presenting. Sometimes people's interests encourage them to take such action. And I would say that we have had some issues with that in Staffordshire in recent years as well, unfortunately.
Just to say that I appreciate that obviously motivation is important, but the issue is that nobody must be discouraged from raising a concern, because often what you'll get is a culture developing, and you need someone to point out that that culture is developing and is unacceptable. So, we may not be the worst the worst offender in terms of complaints, but we always have to be vigilant that culture does not get created, because of course officers do shift between different forces, and consequently you can get a culture being developed from another force or another service, because different people move in and out of different services. So I think it is important that we're vigilant that culture does not develop in Staffordshire.
Certainly.
Councillor Atkins, I couldn't agree more. I think it's absolutely essential. In fact, one of the things that is going to be at the forefront of my next plan for both services is for both of them to pay more attention. I'm not suggesting they don't pay enough, but I think they could pay more attention to what people who are complaining about a service are saying, staff feedback, and also the feedback of victims and others, and balance that with the expectations of residents. I think every large organisation can drift into a space where it is concerned about those who measure them, concerned about their peers, and they forget who they're looking after. So for me, that piece around, it won't be quite as stark as that. It's really around engagement, listening to people and making sure that we're looking after Staffordshire and not the interests of other parts of the country and things like that. But in terms of whistleblowing, absolutely, and I will always encourage and do promote complaints. Quite a lot of correspondence to me will involve in me asking them to take the next step to complain, because there is always learning at the back of that process.
There's another question there, thank you. Yep.
Thank you, Chair. And just building on that, one of the things that really jumped out at me, not necessarily in relation to the misconduct section of the report, but the complaint section, was what you would hope is good news is that the level of complaints that we receive is currently low, averaging about 41 a year. I know from my experience working with in a different part of the public sector, low complaint rates can be a function of one of two things. Either there's nothing to complain about, or people are not complaining. And can we just make sure that when that report comes in February, that we've fully explored that and made sure that we've looked under the rock, so to speak, to check that there's nothing that people want to complain about, as opposed to people aren't making the complaint.
On that, I think that's again a good point, and I'll make sure it's in the report. When we've looked at police complaints before, this panel's I think correctly asked me, how does that compare with other places? Certainly with policing, one of the values of this standardised approach, having the IOPC as an ultimate second place for complaints to be heard, means there's a consistency and you can do cross-force measurement. I think we need the same in fire and rescue. It's all about transparency, and you're quite right. Low numbers is not necessarily a good thing. We've had, certainly, I would be concerned around things like domestic abuse, for example. If there was a reduction or a reducing number of incidents, I'd absolutely want to understand that that was not a result of people feeling they couldn't easily complain or report an incident. Sometimes you need to be absolutely open to hearing what you need to hear.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner, item 9, we're prepared to accept your verbal update on the Commissioner's annual report. Would you like to present that?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Now I'm going to hold myself back here because there's a little bit more in this document than you're going to want to hear me rattle on about. And I'm very conscious that we're going to come in September with a more formal annual report. And at the same time, be talking then about areas of or priorities which I think are going to stick in my report, in my plan, and perhaps a few that will fall away because either we've sort of done it to the extent that we believe we can make a big difference, or we've hit a bit of a brick wall and we're not necessarily in a position to influence in the way that we would have wanted. So you're going to see a plan that will have some things in there that you're used to seeing. However, just taking you through some headlines, I broke the report, my plan down before into various sections. Under a local and responsive, this is really to try and address not so much the performance of the service, but to assist where I could in removing the barriers to the best service from police. And those were really a disconnection between the leadership, the front line, and the quality of engagement with people who are trying to report crime. and then how quickly we're getting to them. Now, I'm really quite delighted that in 3 years, and in fact really in 2 years under our new Chief Constable, we've made some considerable progress. HMI identified the problems 2 years ago really, but put us into the engage process about 20 months ago. They've now discharged Staffordshire Police from that. Staffordshire Police are no longer in special measures, and that correctly pointed out issues with answering the phone and identifying vulnerability, and then issues with the quality of investigation. Both are in a considerably better place. So our 999 answering is now in the top 10 in the country, very, very consistently under 10 seconds, which is the target. And our 101 performance, certainly for those who get dealt with at triage, is much, much better. Now for me, however, those that go beyond triage into the longer calls sometimes to report an incident, still too many people waiting too long. So that's going to stay in the plan as a priority, and it ain't going anywhere until it's sorted out. The Chief Constable's aware, and it will be the first thing that he and I discuss at our public performance meetings every time until the problem's gone away. There's been considerable investment. There's big investment coming in terms of people, systems and others, but we need to deal with that. It's fundamental to the confidence of residents that they can report incidents and, more importantly, pass on intelligence that might be of use to the police. Demand is still increasing, particularly complex demand. Cases are taking longer to handle. But our public surveys are telling us that the public perception's improved, victim satisfaction's improved, arrest rates, if you like, measures of activity of the police are all going in the right direction. And outcomes, which is really a measure of what's been referred for treatment, out-of-court disposal or prosecution, are considerably up and amongst the best in the country. Now this is key. This means that investigations are leading to action. And whether it's taking people into an environment where they can get some support or getting them off the streets, then we're going in the right direction. Now our crime numbers have been a challenge in the last 2 or 3 years, but I was absolutely delighted to see that our 12 months comparison, as reported to me last month, antisocial behaviour is down a further 16%, so that's getting on for 50% reduction in 3 and a bit years. And all crime down 7%. Now that's the first time I've been to the panel and said we've had a significant reduction in crime in my term, which I'm delighted to pass on. Violent crime down 8%, sexual offences down 6%, vehicle crime, which has become a big issue for a number of people in Staffordshire, down 11%, and robbery down 10%. So these are, I think, reflections of a service that is getting a grip. And having response teams back in our localities, local chief inspectors with control on their patch, and proper accountability, I expect to see that continue. We have had full inspections by HMI of both police and fire. They're completed. There's a process to go through, but the reports are likely to be published end of August, early September. So in good time for our next panel meeting, Chair, we can talk about those. I think they're going to be demonstrating the progress that's been made in both services. But we'll wait and see, and no doubt there'll be some things where they feel we can still improve. Over that period, we've added officers. We've got 2,000 officers now across Staffordshire. When I started, I think we got just over 1650, 1660 or something like that. So good increase in numbers, and we're going to retain those numbers and keep building up our team of officers and staff, PCSOs and backroom staff as well. and the Chief Constable has put in a new leadership team. It's a very different feel for Staffordshire Police from when I arrived 3 years ago. Similarly in fire and rescue, our Chief Fire Officer's got a new team, all empowered, doing a fine job, and we're going to talk later about some particular policies to improve availability of service and response times. But core service is up, but also they're stepping into spaces with the health service, which are really setting an example for the rest of the country, particularly returning people home from hospital and going to victims of falls, which I think is really quite exciting for fire and rescue. I'm really, really hopeful we can continue with that under a new government as well, because I think that's the future of fire and rescue. So, just on to some of the stuff we've been doing. Under the other headings, prevent harm and protect people. 100 new officers have gone into the public protection unit. That's the bit of policing. Sexual offences, protection of children, high harm, high risk. Big investment there in extra officers into those key areas. These are the areas that we don't hear about very often as public representatives and councillors. And it's balancing that, it's balancing those demands of risk that I need to do in my plan with what the public say they want to see around a proactive response, visible policing, etc. Getting those balances right is key. We've talked about road safety a little bit. Speed cameras, ANPR, an expanded road policing team going 24/7, and there are conversations and discussions at the moment about our local roads policing and the motorway policing group, which we have a shared service with West Midlands. That might well lead to a further expansion of Staffordshire roads policing. On violence reduction, my team have done a great job in partnership with others. We've introduced the serious violence duty that was expected of Home Office. The Chief Constable and I agreed to get bleed kits in every operational police vehicle. You remember, Chair, that terrible situation a couple of Christmases ago? Lost that young man in your neck of the woods. So why not have bleed kits to hand whenever possible? We've done that. In terms of prevention and early intervention, again, my commissioning team's been involved, particularly around keeping children away from criminals, away from sexual exploitation. The space programme, another 22,000 young people enjoyed that last year, and I'm going to be doing that again. This is probably the least big surprise, but I'll be back in space for another 4 years. It's just too much good news for young people there during the summer holidays. But we also commission, amongst other things, two PSHE coordinators. These are people who will go into schools, pupil referral units, colleges and others, to help them put together good programmes for community safety, knife crime, drug crime, things of that nature. And I see that as a really effective way of helping teachers and teaching assistants to deliver good material in schools. And in fact, they've also helped our PCSOs in terms of a new programme for support in education. And I think of particular note to colleagues around the table, over £900,000 every year into community safety partnerships. This again is going to be a big focus for me in my new plan. Right care, right person has come in nationally. We've talked about that around the table in terms of particularly who's best to look after people with mental health concerns. But actually, right care, right person is also about who's best to deal with local issues, who's best to deal with antisocial behaviour, who's best to deal with parking, who's best to deal with issues related to housing. Quite often, that's a partnership of police and local councils. So I'm looking to strengthen what goes on in community safety partnerships. We have a shared duty to prevent crime, prevent antisocial behaviour, and I will continue to provide funding, providing it's hitting the mark. So there's a series of conversations in the next few months about the impact of what we're doing locally, and let's measure the effectiveness of those interventions. Some great stuff we do, but I think we can do more. And pleased through the year to have got some formality around the whole county and city. Antisocial behaviour training, 239 officers attended, probably from your own councils, to update themselves on what powers and so on they can employ in their local patches. And also we introduced the Drug and Alcohol Partnership, which I chair, and this was to help deliver the government's 10 years from harm to hope strategy. Anybody who's close to this will know that the funding for drug and alcohol has doubled in the last 2 years. About time, it needed to, and we're going to continue to keep pressure on and good working, supportive working with the NHS and others. Both the county and city have got new providers in place. It'll be interesting to see how that works out in the next few months. But that's key, certainly key for community safety, ultimately, as people, unfortunately, commit crime to feed their habits. Safer Streets has been good for us again. I won't go over that in too much detail. And you may just have seen some communications I'm doing around the next phase of our ASB hotspot patrols. So initially, Chair, this was police officers and PCSOs on overtime in our 5 hotspots, but we've now introduced some wardens to support the police. They're still in the same places, Hanley and Etruria, Fenton, Burton, Cannock, Stafford and Newcastle. I've visited Cannock and Newcastle already. Fantastic folk, getting stuck in, and not only enforcing orders, but also diversionary work, particularly for young people. People find themselves homeless or vulnerable, to get them in touch with support workers. And we mentioned victims and witnesses earlier. I've got some stats here. The DA service, that's our domestic abuse service we mentioned, 6,780 adults and children supported. I've got a sexual assault and abuse service, which looked after 560 adults. Hate crime, 1,100 referrals, 339 people supported. And Harmony, which is our ASB service, supported 464 people. Now, a lot of my mailbox is about ASB, particularly neighbours, falling out for years on end sometimes. So this service, which will quite often bring people together, try and help them, what would you call it? I can never quite remember the word when you bring 2 parties together, reconcile themselves or each other. It's valuable stuff, that, and I'm going to be promoting that a bit more. And of course we support business crime. 700 businesses got extra help, and we're using our core grant from government. Interested to see some proposals from in manifestos about how some of that money might be redirected. And I say interested, I mean nervous. I want to keep local support. Don't want to step back to where we were a decade or so ago of national support for victims. This isn't London. It's Staffordshire, and we know exactly what we need to do. By all means, hold us to account nationally, but don't try and direct the service nationally. And our gateway, 63,000 referrals. So everybody who has an issue, is a victim, is receiving advice from the police, can call the Victim Gateway for help. So, Chair, where I said I bumped into a bit of a brick wall, the good news first of all, I was very pleased to see a step change in our out-of-court disposals approach. Staffordshire Police were low in drug treatment orders, rehabilitation orders, addiction orders, things of that sort that might get people into some advice and help rather than criminalising them. And we are doing more of this and actually accelerating with careful watching, make sure it's appropriate, more out-of-court disposals. It's in everybody's interest. As long as we're getting that right, it's in everybody's interests. However, there are issues in getting people into court, and Staffordshire has now got some of the biggest backlogs in the country, if not the biggest increase in backlogs in the country. I'd say we have a good functioning local criminal justice board in terms of relationship. In terms of making the national decision makers around courts step up and do something about it, we're not doing well enough. And that's going to be an area where I'll try not to express my frustration, but I will be putting more pressure on the partnership to deliver results. It is really quite difficult when you're waiting 2-3 years for a court case, possibly reoffending, not getting treatment. Public aren't seeing justice. It is an issue nationally. So that's been an area of some frustration for me. However, in the main, the plan is being delivered. I mentioned to you before, I think more focus on victims, more focus on what complainants are saying the services can do to improve, more balance in terms of engagement. So you'll see references to rural crime, retail crime, and vehicle crime in my plans. Those are the things that are concerning a lot of people in Staffordshire. But of course, working with the Chief Constable, the Chief Fire Officer, to absolutely understand risk and support them in delivering evidence-based services. You wouldn't expect me to do any less. Meanwhile, we'll keep working with the partners around keeping people out of the system and supporting victims to an ever greater degree. And I'm looking forward in September to having that down in some form which you and your colleagues can no doubt have a good look at and chuck some difficult questions at me. Happy to take any comments on what I've said, Chair.
Okay, well, we do have one or two questions, Commissioner, but I wonder if I might just raise a few points with you before we get into the meat of the conversation. I always listen with interest when you're talking about antisocial behaviour, and you've made a point about the figures are reducing. A lot of people wouldn't agree with that. Antisocial behaviour that's recorded is the statistics are going down, but antisocial behaviour on the streets is not. Particularly, I go to 3 parish councils in my part of the world, and antisocial behaviour is a concern to the public. And the general throwaway comment is, well, the police don't really do a lot. Now, I'm not going to go down that pathway, but I would say to you that antisocial behaviour is unique to a space. You cannot generalise across Staffordshire. So I would hope that you would take that on board. When you mention the increase in officers and staff, you made reference to the part of the world that I come from in East Staffordshire. We have a very diverse community there, and I would hope that the recruitment of officers would reflect that diverse community. We have 27 different languages spoken in Burton, and there's Asians, Caribbeans, Muslims, Eastern Europeans. So I would hope that we would see some representation in the police force. Right person, essential, but I would hope that you are taking that on board. Just a general observation as well, just to feed back into this massive equation that you've shared with us. I know that colleagues have spoken to the Chief Inspector about asking for a police officer or a PCSO just to visit parish council meetings, just for that nominated slot. And again, the 3 parish council meetings I go to, for well over a year now, we haven't seen a hide and a hair of a police officer or a PCSO. No chair wants them there for the duration of the meeting, but there is a slot for a report, and it's very, very rarely attended by a uniformed officer. So if you could have a look at that, that would be much appreciated. When you talked about drug rehabilitation processes, that's really welcome, that is. But I'm getting messages around the Burton area now that those that come out of custody, male and female, who may have been on drug rehabilitation orders in custody, but it depends the time that you're in there, the benefit that you get from those orders. There is a gap. Are offenders who are back in the community being picked up by these organisations? And is there a process that local prisons can be informed of, i.e. the pathway to get into that link? And perhaps finally, the news bulletins and press reports now mention retail crime on a regular basis. There seems to be, and I'll use the phrase, organised crime now for people walking into shops with holdalls and big bags to empty the shelves and just walk out. And I understand that a lot of shops are not there to challenge these people. They know they're coming, and half the shop will be emptied because they're coming in with enough equipment to do that. So what's the police's role in protecting retail outlets from this rising scourge, I would think? Colleagues, do you want the Commissioner to answer that, or do you want any more questions before we go on?
Follow up on the retail crime question, because it seems to me that the people that are most vulnerable obviously are shop workers, but what concerns me is that it'll often be the corner shop which is the most vulnerable, because you'll often have a single person running the shop, and they're in no way able to take on people who come and clear their shelves, whether it be of alcohol or whether it be of anything else. So I appreciate that there's a real concern about retail crime totally, and I'm particularly concerned about the vulnerability of shop workers. And some of those big shops may well have CCTV and may well have multiple numbers of staff on duty, but I'm really concerned about the corner shop that serves many of our smaller communities where they are totally vulnerable, and there's no way that they could possibly challenge a number of youngsters or others coming into the shop equipped to clear the shelves.
Okay.
Thanks, Chairman. Yes, some good questions there. I'll work backwards through them if you don't mind. Retail crime in Staffordshire, up until about 6-7 months ago, was not seeing the increases we were seeing in the rest of the country. In the last few months, it's up about 12%. This is mostly shoplifting. I think you'll be pleased to hear, not particularly abuse of shop workers, certainly not violent assaults, but there have been some. And also not the sort of serious organised criminals jumping out of a van and clearing shelves, as they've seen in some cities in particular. That doesn't mean that we're not vulnerable to that, and it doesn't mean the service aren't aware of it. There's an enhanced retail crime plan. I think possibly in the expectation it would be in my plan, because it was something I was campaigning on particularly. And I agree with Councillor Atkins. It's these community shops that are most vulnerable. I've had a number, about hundreds of people write to me during the election who say they work in a shop and they were concerned about this. The engagement with the local officers, local PCSOs, is really key. A relationship, the ability to report as easily and quickly as possible, because it otherwise distracts them from their business, and an appreciation that however small an individual incident is worth in value, if that's happening 2 or 3 times a week, it soon adds up. And actually the community is upset because they might lose the shop. You know, if these businesses aren't at least got the best chance to make a living, they'll shut up. So this matters, I think, to all of us about community shops. The key there for me is engagement, and it's similar actually to some other areas I've mentioned, particularly rural crime. Being closer to the people involved. Again, people living in the countryside, perhaps on farms, living above their shop, literally, above their farm, and so on. Being fully engaged with the police. But then, as you say, Chairman, engagement with community representatives. Now, I know the service are very keen to do better in this respect. There is a local police engagement plan being drawn up at the moment. My team are going to be meeting with the service to go further in terms of confidence building and how we might do more to get information out there. And interestingly, I think, I've had a number of parishes say to me, they do like to see an officer or a PCSO, but in between they'd like a decent report of what's going on in their patch. And if their clerk could just download it or be sent it, work through that with their own members, then if they see an officer or a PCSO to support it every now and again, great, but they've got the information. Now that feels like something we should be able to achieve. But not just parishes, also community groups, housing groups, resident associations, things like that, where quite often there's some myth busting that can be done that is in their interests. It's very easy to think the world's gone mad and is dangerous, when in fact it isn't necessarily like that in your patch. Diversity, pleased to say that our female representation in new officers is still one of the highest in the country. It was running at 50% at one point in recruitment, which is great. Diversity in terms of ethnicity is pretty much in line with the population. But I think there's more that we can do there. What I would say, Chair, is that when I visit graduations, meet new recruits, it's great to see the sheer range of backgrounds that people are coming from, and just how proud their families are that their young son, not always young actually, sometimes. I met somebody, it was their mom the other day. Mom had been a PCSO, wanted to become an officer, and I think she went and did a training at about 35, 36. So her kids were there to cheer her on, which was smashing. Prison and addiction is really a key question. There is an issue when people leave prisons, and managing that period whilst they're in prison and then when they come back into a community is a key piece of work for those drug and alcohol partnerships. It's actually a specific focus of the government target to tackle addiction. The danger there is if people unfortunately don't go to somewhere where they can receive treatment, then they might be back on the street. The nature of what they're taking is not always easy to measure, and you have an overdose risk because of that, an immediate risk to life on leaving prison. And that's another reason why we need our Ministry of Justice not releasing people early, because they need the time and the drug programs to prepare them for release. Planned release is very important. And then finally on ASB, I couldn't agree with you more. Even though we've had those big reductions, we were reasonably high on ASB compared to similar forces. A small percentage of that, probably 7% of the 50, is actually now being crimed. So these are things that would have been called ASB 3 years ago, now being called harassment. Quite good news, actually, because it means the service are getting stuck in at a slightly higher level than earlier. Nonetheless, it is down, but I agree, in certain locations, certainly in public spaces, this is still a very important concern of the public. And that's why all of us are going to get stuck in with our community safety partnerships. It's probably 40% the police, 60% the partnership. And we need to step up and deal with it. And it's not just kids. In fact, it isn't predominantly kids. It's people of an age who should know better, and it's noise, and it's antisocial behaviour, and it's dogs out of control, and all sorts of other things that the councils have the powers to deal with. So we'll be working together in the next 4 years, all of us around this room, to further deal with antisocial behaviour.
Thank you, Commissioner. It's a good point you make there, how indiscriminate it is. And again, we all have feedback from our constituents. Older people are beginning to feel not particularly safe in their homes. They can hear people making a noise. I mean, this story about people throwing eggs at people's windows. If you're living on your own, you become very, very fearful. So I think we're all feeling very reassured by what you've said there, Commissioner. So let's see how it unpacks, and hopefully we'll get some progress around that. Colleagues, any questions for the Commissioner? Yes.
Apologies, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Just a quick one. It was good to hear that the additional funding is going to remain in place for the antisocial behaviour hotspots. How often are the hotspots reviewed? Because I'm very aware of a situation we had in Lichfield a few years ago where we had a real antisocial behaviour hotspot, and the officers who came along and supported with that were excellent, brilliant, and the additional resource of a mobile police station was excellent. But I'm hoping that, well, that place, it's in my ward, so that's very much calmed down now, but I know North Lichfield as a whole is quite heavy for antisocial behaviour. So are there any plans to keep those areas under review?
Yes, thank you. I was a councillor myself in Lichfield. It feels like forever ago now. It was about 18 years ago. And responsible for community safety, and we had a terrible incident in North Lichfield where a man was killed, unfortunately. It's a nice place to live, Lichfield, and actually crime-wise, antisocial behaviour-wise, the statistics are in a good place, and the new commander there, Inspector Green's doing a really good job. I think Lichfield, North Lichfield in particular, it would take quite a jump in the stats for that to get up into the top 10 perhaps. It won't be today, but these areas are specifically picked on evidence, data, number of reports, and the capacity of the intervention to make a difference. Interestingly, the one hotspot we've picked up in Florence and Dresden, which is part of Stoke-on-Trent, it's much more a residential type challenge than some of the others, which are traditional high streets. And I'm really quite keen to see the impact of what we're doing there, because I think it has got other parts of the county and city where there could be some benefit. We've got a general election on, haven't we? So what the nature of that is going forward, there's commitment in both home manifestos to neighbourhood policing, antisocial behaviour. It's going to be interesting to see, again, how directive things are. I would like to make these decisions based on the local police's evidence and stats rather than a one-size-fits-all model. I was a little bit constrained in these hotspots. I'd rather have had 10 rather than 5, but that was the plan at the start. They're the right ones at the minute, and it's having an impact that we can measure. So the key is it's a pilot. Let's see how it goes, and if it works, we'll do some more of it.
Okay. Any more questions over there?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that information, Commissioner. Yet again, though, the report contains a huge amount of statistics, and I appreciate you need to measure performance as best you can. But some of those statistics, I suggest, as a bald number, aren't necessarily helpful. If I could make a deliberately exaggerated point, if we say detection has gone up by 10%, that sounds great. But if detection historically was 80 out of every 100, then 10% is super duper. If it's only 10 out of every 100, then 10% is pretty marginal, to say the least. And there are a lot of instances in those numbers where I don't think we get the context to understand how really helpful they are. Another one might be, oh, we've got a grant of £10,000. Sounds great. But if what you really need is 200,000, it's a drop in the ocean. I'm not saying they're all not useful. Of course they are. But so often, to me, they are isolated numbers which don't really mean anything unless they're put into context. So I don't know if you could think about that, please.
Yes, please.
Chairman, I will. And please keep asking me that question, would you? My first question generally when presented with a stat is, so what? Certainly in my performance meetings, there are some numbers which are positive. I mentioned the outcomes one, for example. We're just leaping ahead of the rest of the country with some of those numbers. But I could do with presenting you with that feedback around some criminal justice measures with the worst out of 8 most similar forces. So courts, delays, file production. And I think you need to hear that context as well. It's certainly the way I drive things, but it's a good challenge. Keep making it, please, because I do have that backup.
Yeah, I think that question is particularly relevant as you prepare for your annual report. Yes. And we would perhaps look now, having been prompted by that comment, to see some reflection or some response in that annual report. Thank you for that question. Right. Shall we move on? Item 10 on the agenda, I'll ask Mandy to speak to Home Officer Grant 23-24.
Thank you, Chair. This is a summary of the allocation of grant which the panel receives from the Home Office, which meets the cost of the panel during 2023-24. It's just a brief summary. Are there any questions from the panel?
There's a question.
I mean, it certainly sounds like a selfish question, but it's not meant to be that way. It refers to the allowance for expenses for members of £920 a year. If I understand correctly, that hasn't changed for quite a long time. Is that so?
It is so. It's set by the Home Office, so we pay the maximum amount that we can to members of the panel, but it is set by the Home Office, and it hasn't changed since the panels were set up.
Commissioner.
Yeah, interesting to note that, because equally, one of these things you don't want to talk about, but Commissioners' remuneration hasn't changed in several years either, despite everybody else in public sector or councils or members of Parliament having increases. So there will be some lobbying of Home Office continuing around reflecting the work we do, because I think the panel's work needs to be properly expensed, and quite frankly I think Commissioners does as well, and it's drifted. It's, I think, several years since there's been any increase at all.
I thought you were going to say you would be sacrificing a proportion of your salary to enhance the panels.
No.
Perhaps not. Thank you. Any more questions? Yes, question there, please.
I'm not sure who this is directed at. Is that a typo on Appendix 1, page 41, where it says the payments listed over the financial year April, is it 24 to 25? Should that be 23, 24?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Right. Item 11 on the agenda then, annual report of the management of complaints and conduct matters against the Commissioner and Deputy Commissioner. Would you like to speak to that, or Andy, are you?
I can introduce that one,
Please.
Chair. As the panel are aware, the panel has a statutory responsibility for handling and recording complaints against the Commissioner and his Deputy. Over the last 12 months, there have been 2 complaints against the Commissioner's personal conduct. Both have been investigated and deemed not to relate to his personal conduct. It's an information report, Chair.
Okay, thank you. We don't need questions on that, do we? No. Right. Item 12 are questions to the Commissioner from panel members. We've had a fair range of those already. Do colleagues have any further questions for the Commissioner? Mr. Robertson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quick one. Are there any plans to change traffic enforcement so that we're enforcing 20-mile-an-hour speed limits?
Sorry, Councillor, I missed that. Traffic enforcement?
Sorry, I will try and get closer to this microphone. Are we looking at hoping to extend traffic enforcement so that we are using the police powers to enforce 20-mile-an-hour speed limits?
Not immediately. There is one or two areas that have got 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. I co-chair the Staffordshire Safer Roads Partnership, and we had a presentation last year from a group who's keen to expand those. As you know, the county, and I believe the city as well, have got a scheme outside schools where 20 is plenty. That's been quite successful. Without enforcement, it's more about education and training people to slow down and signs, those SIDs to indicate the speed, which has helped. I think what's interesting there is going to be the public reaction to the limits that have been imposed in Wales. And there does seem to be, I think, the most friendly way of describing it is a disagreement between members of the same party there as to whether that was a good thing to have done or not, because it's certainly had a reaction in terms of popularity, and in some cases the speed with which emergency vehicles and others are getting to incidents as a result. So I'm very comfortable that we continue to have a watching brief on that. There's no immediate plans that I'm aware of. Where it happens, it's generally going to be with local resident support and consultation. And I don't believe there's anywhere that fancies trying that at the minute. Yeah, let's see what happens.
Please.
Thank you for that. I mean, I know large parts of the district I'm here to represent, particularly actually North Lichfield again, do have 20-mile-an-hour speed limits. And I know one of our parish councils is very eager to try and push that out and have a 20-mile-an-hour speed limit across their parish. One of the problems, though, that we have, I know I get a lot of complaints of people saying that some drivers are inappropriately ignoring that and are actually potentially driving at speeds that would break the 30-mile-an-hour limit, let alone that. And currently, when they try to set up community speed watch or when they try to contact the police, the response is just, sorry, we don't enforce those. So is there a way to even try and put some type of break in there for those wider areas where the 20-mile-an-hour speed limit already exists to try and get some enforcement in there?
Chair?
That's an interesting point. I think where residents have essentially backed that programme, I think myself and the partnership should just look again at what Community Speedwatch can do in those spaces, because those letters of not quite friendly warning, but those letters do have value, and it's really about that community awareness. So I think we'll look at that again in terms of the Community Speedwatch teams being able to send a letter around 20 again. Thanks for the prompt.
Thank you for that. There's another question over there, yes?
Changing the subject completely, we may have heard there's a general election next week, I think. And it looks highly likely that there's going to be a change of government. I'm not saying that's good or bad in this context, but it looks highly likely there will be a change. I just wonder, Commissioner, from your point of view, if there is that change, do you anticipate any changes to your position, or not your position, your role as a commissioner? And if so, does that need any pre-planning, or am I just looking too far ahead? Thank you.
Before we proceed with that, can I just remind colleagues, we're still in Purda, and I don't know where that sits, that question, in terms of asking a political question. Commissioner, would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, without being party political, I don't think either of the two parties most likely to have a majority are looking to change the role of commissioners to any great degree. There are one or two other parties who don't agree with them and have stated that, but in the main, no. I think the role will stay largely the same. There are some manifesto differences around how local decision making is on how you use your service and resources, and also how you direct victim support. My own position, which is not party political and isn't one I've stated before, I think local matters. in these types of decisions, and I really am keen that Staffordshire residents have as much direct line of sight on what their police service and fire and rescue service look like. So whoever's in power, if they bear that in mind, they'll certainly be getting a sort of a lobby to that degree from me and a number of my colleagues, because we think it makes a difference.
Question from Mr. Roberts.
Actually, I was just going to declare an interest as a candidate in that election, but I don't actually think I need to, given the way the discussion went. But just in case, to declare that interest.
Right. Okay. Yes.
Thank you, Chair. It's just going back to the discussion earlier about antisocial behaviour and the possibility that there's a disconnect between the understanding of the public and the actual, I guess, statistics. You know, there's a perception, there's a potential of having an increased perception of antisocial behaviour where it doesn't necessarily exist. And I know there is some areas in Staffordshire that have got very low crime compared to, say, Birmingham. I wonder if you've got any plans to how you communicate that, and not just through the partnerships, but so that there is a greater understanding of that perception, if that makes sense. Yeah. Just thinking out loud.
Yes, absolutely. And when I talk about engagement and how important that's going to be in my new plan, it's two-way. So it's not just listening and hearing about concerns, it's giving people information to make their decisions on. I'm afraid we live in a world where when something goes wrong, everybody knows about it within seconds, and it can seem really horrendous. What we're not very good at is feeding back when something positive has happened or there's been an intervention, or even explaining the issue. And people worry unnecessarily. There was a particular... Which bit of the county do you represent, David?
Cannock Chase.
Cannock. Not in Cannock, but there was a situation several months ago around some vehicle crime in Uttoxeter. And it was rightly really worrying the residents. A lot of people have got Ring doorbell footage of their cars being tried. These characters are all covered in balaclavas and everything. They're there at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I think a vehicle was stolen, certainly a number, there was attempts. And they tried to get into houses to take keys. The whole of Uttoxeter knew about that the next morning by virtue of an 8,000-9,000 Facebook site. A couple of people thought it was a good idea to go and protect the community themselves. They looked a bit like vehicle criminals, and they ended up wasting the police time the next day, actually being interviewed. When the undercover police were trying to identify the vehicle criminals, that wasn't helpful. And then we made an arrest, I think, within a week or so. It affected some areas in the Moorlands as well, which has similarly been targeted. The 9,000 people didn't know about it. And it's a real concern for me. If we've made arrests, if they don't need to worry anymore, but remain vigilant, I think people should know. So it's about engagement, is about listening, but also communicating and, where possible, getting the messages out there. Confidence matters around safety. We want people to feel safe, go to the shops, go to see their friends, go and do whatever they want to do in Staffordshire without worrying about it. And in the main, they can do that.
Okay, thank you. Right. Item 13 on the agenda, dates of future meetings in the work programme. Pages 45, 46 spell that out, but just as a reminder, September the 23rd, 10 a.m. is the time and date of the next meeting, and I'm sure that we'll have a pre-meeting. Item 14 on the agenda, exclusion of the public. The chairman to move that the public be excluded from the meeting for the following items of business, which involve the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in the paragraphs of Part 1 of Schedule 12A, as amended, of the Local Government Act 1972, indicated below. There are no such reports for this meeting. At that point, 11:25, I'll close this meeting. But just now suggest, I haven't spoken to Mandy about this, can we bring forward the 12 o'clock session?
I'm sorry, Chair, no, we can't. We've advertised the 12 o'clock meeting to the public, so we have to start at 12 o'clock.
Okay. Okay, well, the next session will commence at 12 o'clock in this room, and look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you. Thank you for your attendance and good morning.